I'm Margaret Ellison, 72 years old, and I can still remember the sound of the bookstore door closing behind me for the last time. That small chime above the frame had marked 40 years of my life, years spent among rows of paperbacks, the smell of fresh coffee, and the hum of conversation. My doctor had called my recent stroke a warning, but to me it felt more like a door gently swinging shut. Selling the store meant letting go of the place where Daniel and I had built not just a business, but a life. Little did I know, the next door I walked through would be in my son's house, leading me into a space where my voice would start to vanish. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to start over after thinking your story was already written. I was raised in a family where kindness was never just a word. It was a habit. My parents believed in hard work and speaking softly, but showing up when someone needed you. That's the life Daniel and I built together, one where the measure of success was the number of people who felt welcome in our little shop. Even during the lean years, we managed to keep the doors open, sometimes taking home less than we spent just to keep the lights on and the shelves full. We knew our customers by name, knew their favorite authors, knew when to put a new book in their hands before they even asked. When Daniel passed 7 years ago, I kept the shop running. It wasn't easy. The days were long, and the silence at night was heavier than I expected, but the store still gave me purpose. That changed last October when the stroke slowed me in ways I couldn't ignore. Michael and Rachel suggested I move in with them for a little while, just until I felt stronger. They promised it would be easier for everyone, especially for Lily, who adored spending time with me. I imagined sunny mornings at their kitchen table reading the paper, while Lily got ready for school, afternoons helping her with homework or baking something sweet together. The reality began the moment we pulled into their driveway. Michael carried my typewriter to the trunk as if it were just another box talking about a coworker's promotion. Rachel stayed by the passenger door, eyes on her phone. Lily was the only one who looked me in the eye, asking if I felt sad. I told her no, but something in her quiet gaze said she knew better. My new room was in the basement. No windows, just a lamp on a small table and a single picture of a pine forest that wasn't ours. The air smelled faintly of damp carpet. Upstairs, a printed sheet taped to the refrigerator outlined the house rules in neat bullet points. Quiet hours, no TV in shared spaces, no scented products, limited reheating of food with strong smells. There was a smiley face at the bottom, as if that might soften the edges. That first night, I lay awake, listening to the heater click on and off. Somewhere in the walls, the pipes groaned. I told myself it was temporary, that once I felt stronger, we'd find a rhythm. But as I traced the folds in the blanket, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped into a chapter I hadn't meant to write. And I didn't yet know that before long, someone in that house would turn a broom handle into a weapon, and my son would stand by saying nothing. The first time it happened, it was a Tuesday morning. I was standing at the kitchen counter, rinsing raspberries for Lily, when the sound of breaking ceramics startled me. My teacup had been too close to the edge, and it hit the tile in 3 clean pieces. Before I could bend down to gather them, something tapped my shoulder. Not a hand, but the wooden end of a broom handle. I turned slightly, and there was Rachel, her voice light as she said, "Watch it!" The bristle end turned away. The wood was cold against my sweater, firm enough to make its point. She stood there a moment longer than needed, eyes fixed on me, as if I were a child who'd made a mess. Michael was leaning in the doorway, a banana in his hand, watching. He smirked faintly, peeled his fruit, and walked away without a word. I stayed where I was, crouched on the tile, sweeping the shards into a dustpan. The floor was clean within minutes, but I kept wiping, long after letting the quiet stretch in the space where their voices had been. Later that evening, I heard soft footsteps on the stairs. Lily was halfway down, one hand on the railing, her eyes wide and still. She'd seen it. We didn't speak. From upstairs, Rachel's voice floated down, cheerful and casual, calling for Lily to help with laundry. Then she added, "Grandma's just tired today. She tripped earlier." Clumsy old feet. Lily hesitated, glanced at me once more, and turned back toward her room. I didn't mention the broom to anyone. I didn't mention Michael's smirk. The next day, a neighbor dropped by with a lemon tart, and Rachel invited her in for coffee. They sat in the living room, talking about yoga and school admissions. When the neighbor asked how long I was visiting, Rachel answered before I could speak. "Oh, she's helping out with the house while Michael works late. She keeps things running down there." Down there. Not retired bookstore owner. Not mother. Just someone tucked away where no one looked. That night in the basement, I pulled an old journal from my suitcase and wrote a single line: "They are not being cruel. They are being efficient." I closed it and slipped it back under the bed. A few days later, an envelope arrived with the rest of the household mail. Most of it was coupons and bills, but in the middle was a cream-colored card with glittery sunflowers. Inside, in neat, careful cursive, Lily had written, "Dear Grandma, thank you for always smelling like cinnamon and reading to me when nobody else had time. I wish I could sit next to you more." I read it 3 times before folding it into the pocket of my cardigan. That same afternoon, Michael called me upstairs. Rachel was already at the dining table, a folder open in front of her. The air felt staged, like a meeting I hadn't agreed to. Michael gestured toward the empty chair across from them. "Mom," he began. Rachel and I were thinking, that basement room really isn't good for you. No window, no sunlight. The stairs aren't safe long term. I didn't respond. His tone was too careful, too prepared. Rachel smiled in that polished way she had. "If we move you into the upstairs guest room, you'll have a view of the garden, more morning light, and it'll be easier for Lily to visit you. We were also wondering if you'd consider updating the house deed to include our names. It would make things simpler in the long run if anything ever happens." She nudged the folder toward me. I looked past her out the window at the tulips beginning to wilt. April was almost over. I remembered planting tulips with Daniel in front of the bookstore, always choosing yellow ones that bloomed early and faded fast. I nodded slowly. "That room upstairs does sound nicer," I said. Michael exhaled like a weight had lifted, and Rachel closed the folder. "Whenever you're ready." "No pressure," she said. That night, folding laundry in the basement, my hand brushed against the envelope in my cardigan pocket. Lily's words felt like a small anchor. "Thank you for always smelling like cinnamon." I set the laundry aside and opened a box of Daniel's things. On top was the draft of his last will, my name written beside sole inheritor, and beneath it, a sticky note in his handwriting. "If anything ever makes you feel small, get back up and write the story yourself." I folded the note beside Lily's card and tucked them away together. The second time Rachel struck me, it was my hand she hit. Dinner dishes were done, and I had reached for the broom to sweep up some crackers Lily had dropped. The handle slipped in my grip, and before I could adjust it, Rachel yanked it away. The wooden end caught the back of my wrist in one swift motion. I didn't cry out. My hand ached in a slow, pulsing way, the sting climbing up my arm. Michael had already gone upstairs, saying he needed to answer emails. Rachel didn't apologize. She simply said, "It's dangerous to wave things around like that. You're lucky Lily wasn't nearby and left the room." I stayed seated at the breakfast nook, looking at the pale gray tiles under my feet, each one cold to the touch. A few minutes later, I heard a faint shuffle behind the curtain separating the kitchen from the hall. Lily stepped out with a small first aid box. Her eyes moved to my wrist, and without a word, she took out a cold compress, pressing it gently into my palm. She wrapped it carefully, biting her lip in concentration. "You didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. I met her eyes. "I know I said." She lingered a moment, then put the box away and went upstairs. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I thought about the same hand that had once written bedtime stories, held Lily after fevers, folded birthday letters into envelopes scented with lavender. Now it sat aching on my lap, marked by someone else's temper. I went to the chest in the corner and pulled out a half-finished novel I'd abandoned years ago. It was about a woman who starts over in her 70s. I added a new page in pencil. She didn't break. She bent quietly, then stood straighter than before, choosing her own next chapter. The attic had always been off limits, but the next morning the house was empty. Lily at a field trip, Michael at work, Rachel at a conference. I climbed the stairs slowly and opened the attic door. Dust hung in the air and light spilled through a small round window. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled in Michael's handwriting. Toward the back, under a broken lamp, was one with my name, Mom Old Papers. Inside, I found a folder marked Will 2011 in Daniel's handwriting. Beneath it was his old pocket notebook, its leather edges worn. Inside were inventory notes for the store, a few favorite quotes, and one line written for me. "If I go first, let her write. Let her live where she wants. Let her start again if that's what she needs." Underneath, I found the manuscript I thought I'd lost during our last move. The pages were yellowed, clipped together with a rusted binder. I flipped to the last line I'd written. She waited, not because she had to, but because she hoped someone would see her again. I pulled a blank page from the back and began writing without stopping. I am not writing fiction anymore. I am writing what is real. About women, silenced women, labeled burdens, women who vanish inside their own homes. When I was finished, my handwriting looked steadier than it had in years. I placed the pages in a padded envelope and slipped it into my bag. That night, when Rachel noticed dust in my hair, I told her I'd been going through some of Daniel's boxes. She only raised her eyebrows and stirred her tea. Michael didn't look up from his phone. In the basement, I opened my laptop. The password was still the name of our old bookstore, and scanned the new pages. I also made copies of the original deed papers for the house Daniel and I had sold years ago. When I was done, I folded Daniel's letter and placed it in the drawer by my bed. No one knew what I was preparing, but I did. I wasn't waiting for kindness anymore. I was gathering the pieces for something larger, something that would not be hidden in a basement. The morning after I found Daniel's notebook in the attic, I woke before sunrise. The house was still the kind of quiet that lets you hear the hum of the refrigerator through the floorboards. I sat on the edge of the bed with the padded envelope in my lap, feeling the weight of the pages inside. The words I had written the day before felt different now. Not a memory, not a plan, but a beginning. By the time footsteps started upstairs, I had already tucked the envelope into my bag and folded the blanket neatly over the bed. I climbed the stairs, keeping to the side so the boards wouldn't creak, and stepped into the kitchen. Rachel was at the counter, pouring coffee, her phone propped up beside her. She glanced at me briefly, then slid the pot a few inches closer. "You're up early," she said. I nodded and reached for a mug, careful not to brush against her. Michael came in a few minutes later, straightening his tie. "We might have someone coming by to talk about the guest room later this week," he said, casually. Rachel's eyes flicked toward me over the rim of her cup. "If we can get it set up soon, you'll be more comfortable." I stirred a little sugar into my coffee, keeping my hands steady. They didn't mention the deed this time, but the offer hung there unspoken. The rest of the day passed in a slow rhythm. I read in the basement, sorted through a box of old photographs. and listened to the muffled sound of Lily practicing piano upstairs. After dinner, I washed dishes at the sink. Rachel dried them beside me, placing each one into the cabinet with deliberate precision. When the last plate was stacked, she set the towel on the counter and said, "You should really think about what we talked about. It's better to handle these things before they become urgent." Her tone was even, but her eyes didn't leave mine until I nodded. That night, the basement felt colder than usual. I pulled an extra quilt from the chest and wrapped it around my shoulders. In the quiet, I could hear the faint clicking of the heater, the settling of the house. I reached for Lily's card in my cardigan pocket and held it under the small lamp's light. The pencil marks were already softening the way handwriting does when it's been handled too often. A week later, the second Broom incident happened. Lily had been helping me set the table for dinner when a sleeve knocked over a box of crackers. The pieces scattered under the table. I went to the pantry for the broom, holding it loosely in my hand as I bent to sweep. Rachel entered the room, quickly took the handle from my grip, and in the same motion, the wooden end struck the back of my wrist. "It's dangerous when you wave things around like that," she said, her voice almost casual. "You're lucky Lily wasn't standing close." She turned away without looking back. My wrist pulsed with a dull ache. I sat down at the breakfast nook, staring at the pale tiles, each square catching the overhead light in a slightly different shade. Michael's voice carried faintly from upstairs, talking about some work deadline. He hadn't been in the room to see it this time. A soft sound drew my attention, the swish of fabric against the hallway wall. Lily stepped into view, holding a small white box. Without a word, she set it on the table, opened it, and took out a cold compress. She pressed it gently against my hand, wrapping the cloth with careful, deliberate turns. "You didn't do anything wrong," she whispered. I met her eyes, steady and certain, and said, "I know." She gave the wrap one last pat before tucking the box under her arm and heading back upstairs. When the house was quiet again, I went to the corner where I kept Daniel's will and notebook. I added Lily's card to the stack and opened the half-finished novel I'd found in the attic. I turned to the back, smoothed a blank page, and wrote in pencil. She didn't break. She bent quietly, and then she stood straighter than before. The words settled on the page without hesitation. The next morning, I decided to see what else the attic held. Michael had taken Lily to school, and Rachel was in town running errands. I climbed the narrow staircase and pushed the door open, letting the light spill over the rows of boxes. I walked slowly past them, reading the labels in Michael's neat handwriting. At the back, under the same broken lamp, the box with my name still sat where I had found it before. This time, I opened every folder inside. There were tax returns from decades past, letters from old friends, and receipts from the early years of the bookstore. Beneath them was a small stack of my earliest manuscripts, the paper yellowed at the edges. I recognized the handwriting, instantly loops and strokes that belonged to a younger version of myself, a woman still learning how to put her thoughts into form. I sat on a low stool and read a few pages. The stories were uneven, sometimes clumsy, but each one carried a voice I hadn't heard in a long time. I placed them back in the box carefully, then reached for my bag. The envelope with the new pages went on top. The flap sealed tight. By the time I came down from the attic, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. Rachel returned not long after carrying grocery bags. She glanced at me and said, "You've been busy noticing the dust in my hair." "Just looking through some of Daniel's things," I said. She paused for a moment, then started unpacking without another word. That evening, I sat at my small desk in the basement, opened my laptop, and scanned the new pages into a folder I had titled Second Chapter. I copied the deed papers I'd kept from the sale of our old house, sliding the originals back into a safe envelope. The folder closed with a soft click, the screen fading to black. Upstairs, the television murmured in the living room. I folded Daniel's note and placed it in the nightstand beside Lily's card. The basement light clicked off under my hand, and in the darkness, I listened to the quiet hum of the house. I didn't know yet exactly when I would leave, but the pieces were coming together. I had stopped waiting for the air to feel warm again down there. Instead, I was finding my own way toward the door. The morning light filtered weakly through the narrow gap under the basement door, a reminder of the world moving above me. I sat at the small desk, turning Daniel's note over in my hands. His handwriting, though faded, still carried the same firmness I had known in his voice. I slid it back into its place with Lily's card, then reached for the folder where I had kept the deed copies and my newly written pages. The pieces were here. They simply needed to be put into motion. I started making small changes, nothing noticeable enough to draw questions. A few important papers found their way into the bottom of my suitcase. I kept my purse zipped with the envelope inside, never leaving it unattended. When I went upstairs, I began scanning the kitchen for the times Rachel and Michael were most distracted moments I could slip away to make calls or search online without them glancing over my shoulder. One afternoon, Rachel mentioned again that the upstairs guest room would be ready soon. She spoke while wiping the counters, her tone brisk, but practiced. "It'll be nice for you to have more space," she said. I nodded, keeping my attention on the tea I was pouring. She didn't bring up the deed this time, but I could feel the suggestion waiting. Later that week, I tested the timing of the morning routine. Michael left for work first, often in a rush, his tie still being adjusted as he stepped out the door. Rachel left after Lily caught the school bus, usually with her phone pressed to her ear as she walked to the car. That left a small pocket of time when the house was quiet. I began to use those minutes carefully. In the basement, I sorted my belongings into two groups, what could fit in one suitcase and what I could leave without regret. Old sweaters, a few favorite books, and the laptop went into the keep pile. Furniture, extra shoes, and duplicate kitchen items stayed where they were. I folded everything neatly so that when the moment came, packing would take minutes, not hours. One morning, while I was upstairs making coffee, Lily came into the kitchen in her school sweater, her hair still damp from the shower. She set her backpack on a chair and reached for a banana. "Grandma," she asked quietly, "will you come to my school play next month?" I told her I would, and she smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Rachel called from the hallway for her to hurry, and Lily gave me a small wave before heading out. The moment stayed with me the rest of the day. That evening, I called the bank from the basement phone, keeping my voice low. I confirmed that my accounts were still listed solely in my name and asked about setting up an additional savings account. The woman on the line gave me the details I needed. I wrote them down in the back of my notebook, then tore out the page and placed it with my other important documents. The following weekend, Rachel hosted a small gathering in the living room. I stayed in the kitchen clearing dishes and keeping to the edges of the conversation. When one of her friends asked where I was staying, Rachel gestured toward the basement stairs. "She's comfortable down there. It's easier for her," she said, her voice smooth. I smiled politely when their eyes turned to me, then went back to the sink. The next day, I found myself back in the attic. I retrieved the box with my name and lifted out Daniel's notebook. I flipped through until I reached the pages where he had written ideas for the bookstore expansion plans, community events, even a small lending library. The notes stirred something I hadn't felt in a long time. I closed the cover and sat for a moment, letting the dust and quiet settle around me. When I came down, I checked the clock. There was still half an hour before Rachel and Lily returned from errands. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, opened the second chapter folder, and began drafting a letter. It wasn't to Michael or Rachel, it was to someone I trusted to help me take the next step. The words came slowly at first, then with more certainty. I explained what I had, what I needed, and why I was reaching out. That night, I placed the letter in my bag, ready to be mailed the next morning. I moved through the rest of the evening without changing my routine, making tea, folding laundry, and answering Rachel's casual questions about the weather. In the basement, I added one last sweater to the suitcase and zipped it halfway. By the end of the week, I had mailed the letter, confirmed my new bank account, and ensured that every important document was either with me or copied. The next step was choosing the day. I watched the calendar quietly, noting the times the house would be empty for hours at a stretch. One Thursday evening, after dinner, Michael sat at the table scrolling through his phone while Rachel sorted mail. She handed me an envelope addressed to me, likely from a catalog or charity. I thanked her and slipped it into my cardigan pocket without opening it. It joined the other quiet preparations I had made, small, deliberate steps towards something I wasn't ready to name out loud yet. In the basement that night, I stood by the packed suitcase. The room looked unchanged, but I knew otherwise. Every detail, the folded blanket, the organized desk, the cleared shelves, was part of a plan. I reached over to turn off the lamp, the soft click marking the end of another day. Above me, the floorboards creaked with the sound of footsteps heading to bed. Soon, the house would be silent again, and I would keep moving forward, one careful step at a time. It was still dark when I woke, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound carry. I dressed quickly, pulling on the cardigan with Lily's card still tucked in the pocket. My suitcase was already packed, the zipper pulled all the way around, the handle extended. I lifted it just enough to feel its weight, then set it down by the door. Upstairs, the refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. I moved carefully, each step measured so the boards wouldn't give me away. On the counter, Rachel's printed house schedule was still taped neatly in place, reminders for chores, meal prep, and quiet hours. I peeled it from the surface, folded it once, and dropped it into the trash. As I reached for the back door, I heard the soft shuffle of feet behind me. I turned to see Lily wrapped in her robe, hair loose and a little tangled. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she stepped closer and opened her palm. Lying there was a bookmarked cardboard covered with hand-drawn flowers and glitter. Across the middle, in her careful handwriting, were the words, "I believe you." I took it gently, the edges warm from her hand. My voice caught before I could say anything, so I just nodded. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me in a quick but steady hug. When she let go, she turned and walked back down the hallway toward her room. I stood still for a moment, then opened the door and stepped outside. The street was quiet, the air cool enough to sting my cheeks. I pulled the suitcase behind me, the wheels clicking softly over the concrete. 2 blocks away, the bus stop sat under a streetlight that was just beginning to dim. I didn't look back until the bus turned out of the neighborhood, and when I did, it wasn't to dwell, it was to close that part of the story. By the time I reached the old bookstore space, the sky had shifted to a pale gray. The lock turned smoothly as if no time had passed at all. Inside, the air held the faint smell of paper and dust. My name, though faded, was still just visible on the awning outside. I stood in the middle of the room, suitcase at my side, and let the stillness settle around me. The shelves in the back room were still intact. A few old labels clung stubbornly to the wood, poetry, history, local authors. I ran my fingers over one, then opened the suitcase and began unpacking. Not everything, just the things that mattered: my laptop, the envelope of papers, Daniel's notebook, and the bookmark Lily had given me. The first hours passed quietly. I wiped down the counters, swept the floors, and opened the blinds to let the light in. Outside, people walked by without stopping, but I didn't mind. I needed to learn the space again, to move through it until it felt like mine. By the end of the week, the dust was gone, the windows were clean, and the back office was cleared. In the front corner, I set up a small table with a coffee pot and a sign that read, "Free coffee, free ideas." The first visitors were just curious passers-by, a pair of women who had been regulars years ago, an older man looking for directions. Some stayed for a cup, others left quickly, but each left the air a little warmer than before. That Sunday, I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I hadn't called in over a year, Leanne Porter. She'd once been a customer, but more importantly, she was an attorney who had helped me when I almost sold the store after Daniel passed. I left a message explaining that I wanted to talk about starting something new, though I wasn't ready to explain it over the phone. She called back that evening, her voice warm but direct. We met the next afternoon at the small table in the corner. I poured coffee for us both, and she listened without interrupting as I outlined my idea. It wasn't just about books or community events. It would be a place for women, especially older women, who had been overlooked, pushed aside, or silenced. I told her I wanted to offer workshops, legal resources, and a space where stories could be written and shared without judgment. Leanne leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, and after a moment, she smiled. "I'll help," she said. "No fee. Just promise me you'll see it through." I agreed, and we began sketching out what it would take to make it happen. In the days that followed, I put up a handwritten note in the front window, "The second chapter coming soon." It wasn't much, but it drew attention. A few women stopped by asking what it meant. I told them it was a place where they could share their stories, learn their rights, and find support. Some nodded, and left others stayed to talk. A week later, one of the women asked if she could use a corner of the store to hold a journaling workshop. I cleared the space and brought in extra chairs. Another suggested a discussion group on setting boundaries with adult children. Soon, a donation jar sat on the coffee table, not for money, but for written notes. They came folded sometimes in envelopes, sometimes just scraps of paper. One read, "I haven't spoken to my sister in 10 years. Another said, "My son manages my bank account. I want it back." I read each one carefully, folded it again, and kept them together in a small wooden box on the desk. By the end of the month, the front window bore a new sign, "The Second Chapter Foundation, Quiet Voices, Real Power." Next to it, taped neatly to the glass, was a copy of Lily's bookmark. The original stayed with me tucked between Daniel's note and the envelope of pages, but this one faced outward where anyone passing by could see the words, "I believe you." The foundation was still small, still growing, but every time the bell over the door rang, I knew the work had already begun. And soon, more people than I expected would hear about it. The call came on a Tuesday morning. A woman from a local public affairs program said she had heard about the Second Chapter Foundation through a community referral. She explained they were featuring small organizations making a difference and wanted to include us. I listened as she outlined what the segment would cover, then told her I would do it only if my name and face weren't used. She agreed, assuring me the focus would be on the work itself. 2 weeks later, the interview was recorded in the shop. The crew set up cameras near the front window, careful to avoid showing anything that could identify me. I spoke about the women who came through our door not by name, but about the situations they faced. Legal concerns, family pressure, the quiet ways people could lose control of their own lives. When it was over, they packed up quickly, thanking me for my time. The segment aired on a Thursday evening. I didn't have a television in the shop anymore, but within hours, my phone started ringing. Messages came from women across the state. Some said they didn't know they were allowed to say no. Others admitted they had been told they were too sensitive or ungrateful when they tried to speak up. Many just said they thought they were alone until they saw the broadcast. Leanne came by the next day with a notebook already filling with names and contact information. "These are the women who want to meet some in person, some by phone," she said. We decided to start a small group for those who wanted to talk privately before attending larger events. By the weekend, there were more than 60 names on the list. The story traveled farther than I expected. A local newspaper wrote a short piece, then a national blog reposted the video clip. Within 2 days, the foundation's website stopped loading because of the traffic. We had to set up a new hosting plan just to keep it online. I didn't know it then, but in Michael and Rachel's living room, the same segment was playing on their television. Rachel stood with the remote in her hand, staring at the blurred shot of the shop window, and my voice telling a story she recognized too well. "She's trying to make us look like monsters," she said. Michael sat on the edge of the couch, his eyes fixed on the screen. He didn't answer. Rachel's tone sharpened. "You're just going to let her drag our family through the mud?" He still didn't speak. His gaze stayed on the image of the window where the copy of Lily's bookmark hung. For a moment, he saw something else, Lily slipping the original into my suitcase that morning, thinking no one had noticed. He set the remote on the coffee table, rose from the couch, and walked toward the hallway without a word. Back at the shop, I was folding chairs after a small workshop when Leanne came in holding her phone. "They ran the segment online too," she said, showing me a photo of the shop from the broadcast. The front sign, the coffee table, a partial shot of me from behind, speaking to a circle of women. She studied me for a moment. "You know, this is bigger than just a foundation now, don't you?" I didn't answer, just glanced at the stack of new story submissions waiting to be read. The calls kept coming in the evenings, often from the same number. If I didn't answer, the phone would stop after 2 rings. Rachel never left a voicemail. Michael did once, saying he hoped I was safe and that Lily had been asking about me. He suggested meeting for lunch, his words hesitant. I didn't return the call. It wasn't anger keeping me from it, just a need to protect the space I had built. In those weeks, the women who came through the door brought with them stories that echoed pieces of my own. Angela, a retired teacher, had signed over her apartment to her youngest son and was now sleeping on a friend's couch. Maria still cooked and cleaned for a daughter-in-law who called her useless. And one rainy Tuesday, a woman named Unji walked in her small frame wrapped in a damp coat. She spoke little English and kept her purse close. Her fingers curled tightly around the handles. Leanne offered her tea, and I sat with her near the heater at the back. We used simple words, hand gestures, and eventually a volunteer translator to bridge the gap. Slowly, her story unfolded. She had come from South Korea 2 years earlier to live with her son. She cooked for him, cared for his children, and gave up her pension. When she asked to visit her sister in Chicago, he told her no, that she didn't belong here, that she wasn't going anywhere. She wanted to leave, but she had no documents, no income, and no one to help her. We spent the rest of the afternoon filling out forms. With the translator's help, we contacted a women's shelter that provided language support and temporary housing. We made copies of her passport and drafted a letter to her consulate. When everything was ready, she placed her hand over mine and said the only 2 English words she knew clearly. "Thank you." That night, I walked through the quiet shop. A group of volunteers were folding brochures for the next workshop. Leanne was sorting through a stack of notebooks. I paused at the front window where we displayed a small collection of donated books. In the center sat a copy of the second chapter journal, not for sale, but as a reminder for anyone passing by that making it out was possible. The phone buzzed in my pocket. Michael's number lit the screen. I didn't open the message. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew exactly where I was meant to be. And sometimes, not answering was its own form of presence. One afternoon, while I was reviewing intake forms in the quiet back corner of the foundation, Leanne approached with a small envelope in her hand. It had no return address, just my name in a child's uneven handwriting. She placed it on the table without a word and left me to open it. Inside was a thin booklet, several sheets of folded paper stapled together. Across the front, written in blue ink, were the words, "Chapter 1.5" by Lily Ellison. My chest tightened before I even turned the first page. It wasn't a story in the usual sense, just short paragraphs each with a small drawing beside it. A sun above a window. A woman sitting alone with a book. A figure at a kitchen counter. Her words were simple, but they carried more weight than many books I had read. She wrote about the night she saw me packing my suitcase, how she wanted to say something, but didn't know if she was allowed. She described the house feeling colder after I left, how her mother told her I had been dramatic, and how that didn't feel right to her. One page was about the evening Rachel raised her voice in the kitchen while I stood silent. Lily wrote that she didn't understand why adults acted that way, but she hoped she would be different. The last page had a drawing of the bookmark she had given me, and beneath it, in her careful printing, were the words, "I still believe you." I sat for a long time holding that booklet, the paper warm in my hands from being read over and over. It wasn't just a gift, it was proof that something I had done had reached her. Later that week, I addressed an envelope to Lily. Inside, I placed a fresh notebook with a short letter tucked in the first page. I told her I had read every word she wrote, that I was proud of her voice, and that she should keep writing for herself, not for anyone else's approval. I sealed the envelope and placed it in the outgoing mail pile by the door. When I returned to my desk, my eyes caught on the framed cover of our first foundation publication hanging on the wall. Below the title in small print were the words, written by those who were told to be quiet. It reminded me why we had started all this, not to speak louder, but to make sure no one had to wait for permission to tell their story. A few afternoons later, the bell above the shop door chimed. I was in the front room sorting through a box of donated books, the air carrying the faint smell of old paper and dust. I didn't look up right away, but then I heard her voice. "Hi, Grandma." I turned, and there was Lily in the doorway. She'd grown taller in just a few months, her hair pulled into the same loose braid I used to help her with before school. She walked toward me, her hand closed around something. When she reached me, she opened her palm. Lying there was the original bookmark, the one she had slipped into my suitcase that morning I left. "I kept it," she said softly. "I thought maybe one day I'd give it back." She didn't say why, and I didn't ask. I knelt down, opened my arms, and she stepped into them. Her shoulders eased, and for a moment, neither of us moved. When we let go, I told her she could stay for a while if she wanted. "I have tea in the back and a whole stack of books that need sorting," I said. She nodded, following me toward the back room. As we passed the mission plaque on the wall, she reached out, brushing her fingers along its edge, before glancing back at me with a small smile. It was the kind of smile that felt like a new beginning, though no one had said the words aloud. We spent the rest of the afternoon in the soft light of the back room, the sound of pages turning between us. And for the first time in a long while, the air felt steady, like something was taking root. Lily didn't come every day, but over the next few weeks, she stopped by often enough that her visits became part of my routine. Sometimes she'd help me shelve books, other times she'd simply sit in the back room with a cup of tea working in her notebook. I never asked what she was writing, and she never offered to show me. It was enough to see her there, the quiet between us, no longer heavy, but comfortable. One Saturday afternoon, Rachel came to pick her up. She stepped inside, hesitating in the doorway as if unsure she was welcome. Lily looked up from her seat and without prompting, walked over to her mother. They exchanged a few words I couldn't hear, and then Rachel turned to me. "Thank you for looking out for her," she said softly. I nodded, sensing it was all she could manage. As they left together, I realized that my role in Lily's life had shifted. I wasn't the daily presence I once was, but I had become something steadier, someone she knew would be here no matter how much time passed between visits. That mattered more than I had imagined. Spring was beginning to turn the air warmer, and the foundation was preparing for its annual reading event. This year, I decided to include a new segment short works from young writers in the community. When I told Lily about it, she listened quietly, then said she might have something to submit. She didn't promise, and I didn't press her. 2 weeks later, she handed me a folded sheet of paper. It wasn't signed with her full name, just Lily E. The piece was about a window in winter and how it could hold both the cold outside and the warmth inside at the same time. Reading it, I thought of her how she had learned to hold both hurt and hope without letting one erase the other. The night of the event, her piece was read aloud by a volunteer. I watched her from across the room, her eyes fixed on the reader, a faint smile at the corner of her mouth. In that moment, I knew she didn't need me to tell her she had found her voice. She already knew. Looking back, I see now that justice isn't always a loud verdict or a clear victory. Sometimes it's the slow rebuilding of trust, the quiet return of dignity, the choice to keep showing up. It's knowing that the story didn't end in silence. If you've ever carried both the cold and the warmth, I hope you remember there's strength in holding them together. And if this story has stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share it with someone who might need it, and if you haven't already, subscribe so we can keep telling these stories together.